There's a role for civil disobedience, but it really has to be, I think, civil.
Maybe never even set foot there.
Reminiscent of the 3/5 clause.
It does show how fast things change.
On this episode of Transition Virginia.
Wait a minute, I thought we were going to change the name.
Well, it's still Transition Virginia for now.
Oopsies.
We're joined by the former Democratic leader of the House of Delegates, David Toscano.
I've been keeping notebooks every year I've been in the General Assembly.
He'll tell us about his new book out this week titled Fighting Political Gridlock.
Boy, did I get people angry at me.
We also talk a little prison gerrymandering.
People who are in prison have just as much of a right to voice their opinion.
Plus, we check our voicemail.
We are working on creating a public awareness campaign.
From the future of the assault weapons ban to redistricting hijinks and everything in between.
The term is called rat fucking.
Wait, what was that? Say it again.
That's very embarrassing.
All that and a few other surprises on this episode of Transition Virginia.
I didn't really agree with that, and I thought it was kind of silly.
None of that is good.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, or at least the podcast we're still calling Transition Virginia for now. I'm Michael Pope.
I'm Thomas Bowman. Later in the podcast, we interview former House Democratic leader David Toscano. He has a new book out this week titled Fighting Political Gridlock: How States Shape Our Nation and Our Lives. Michael, I really enjoyed our chat with former leader Toscano. It's not every day you get to pick an author's brain about their work.
It's a fascinating read, and you'll definitely want to stick around to hear what Leader Toscano has to say about everything from the motion picture tax credit, to the right to work, to the Dillon Law, to even, Thomas, his next book.
Tease.
Which sounds like it has a lot of really interesting things in his next book as well. But first, Thomas, this is the point of the show where we welcome our new Patreon. So who are we welcoming this week?
Michael, we have 2 new Patreons to thank this week. Jeremiah C. signed up as a friend of the team and bought you a coffee this month to help you stay up late producing those patron podcasts. And welcome Jordan M., who signed up for the legislative candidate tier to help cover one of our many required monthly subscriptions.
Wait, Thomas, did you say legislative candidate? What are these tiers?
Yes. We've rebranded the tiers, and it is our newest tier for fans of Transition Virginia who like the show so much they can cover the full monthly cost of a subscription, something like our podcast host or our website host.
Well, that's great for us, and thank you to the Patreons who are doing it. What did they get out of this?
They get an on-air shout-out. Check. They get full access to patron-only posts, and the fun part, Michael. You know how sometimes we ask followers on social media to send in questions for a guest we're about to interview?
Uh-huh.
All right, well, we've promised to answer at least 2 questions from patrons in the legislative candidate tier when we put a call out.
Well, that's great. I can't wait to see what kind of questions we get. Speaking of our fans, we did hear from one on Twitter about our new music. Lauren Kaiser says, bring back the old intro and outro music. So thank you, Lauren. I happen to be quite fond of that song, but I have to say it was not popular.
Lauren, you don't know how happy your tweet made Michael. Speaking of Twitter, Michael, did you know we're doing a meme contest?
I saw one of the memes. It was very clever.
Oh, yeah. Nice roast from VA Political Memes. But the reason he did that is because Transition Virginia is holding a meme contest because we want to build excitement. We're getting ready to hit 20,000 downloads. We'll do it either this month or next month, Michael.
Break out the champagne.
That's right. And we want your help to get us there. So if you've got a great meme that could spread the news about Transition Virginia, the podcast, we can get there faster and you can have fun doing it. So right now, our winner is VA Political Memes, the bird, Michael, because he roasted us. And it was a great roast.
It was a great roast. Speaking of roasts, we've got one right now. So later in the show, we're going to hear about this new book from David Toscano, but he's not the only author out with a new book. Check out this message from one of our sponsors.
This message brought to you by Fundamental Ultra-Conservative Knowledge Press that is solely responsible for its content.
Friends, I'm here to tell you about a new must-read book by Brother Colin Sphincter, Vaccination, The Secret Strategy for U.S. Commie Dominance. Chock full of faith-based truths, inspired conjectures, and holy visions. This book is a chilling testament that proves the vaccination plot is out to inject true patriots with soul-altering compounds and genetically engineered Marxist microbes that'll lead us into subjugation of servitude to the communist bosses. We use no long sentences, no scientific jargon with confounded reasoning, none of them big fancy Eastern Ivy League elitist words designed to confuse us. This book is not available at stores. You can't find it on the social disease-ridden .commie internet. No siree, just pick up your phone and call. Deuteronomy 6-6621. Do it now before it's too late.
Cost of each book is $24.99 plus shipping and handling. Overseas telephone tolls and foreign graft charges may apply.
That was, once again, our friend, the award-winning editorial cartoonist Steve Artley with yet another gem. So thank you, Steve Artley. Thomas, did you catch the name of the publisher? Fundamental Ultra-Conservative Knowledge Press. That's a cleverly concealed acronym.
Steve really captured the ridiculousness in the arguments about vaccinations with that one. And Michael, once again, I'm going to say we really need some quality control over who our sponsors are.
True. Yeah. I also like the title Vaccination. It reminded me of that right-wing book from like a decade ago called Obama Nation. You recall that book?
I tried to forget it.
Okay, well, let's get on to the news. Recent years have seen an increased focus on partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, but there's another version of gerrymandering that Virginia is currently in the process of ending: prison gerrymandering. Daquan Love at the Virginia NAACP says inmates should not be counted as non-voting residents of the rural white communities where they're incarcerated. This is what he told me in my discussion with him this week.
This practice of prison gerrymandering is reminiscent of the 3/5 clause. For decades and years, folks have been trying to discount the counting of Black people in this Commonwealth and in this country. White rural communities receive the benefit of a Black population that is voiceless.
Now, Thomas, in 2020, the Virginia General Assembly changed the longstanding practice of counting people where they're incarcerated. That means the next set of maps created by the Redistricting Commission, they'll end up helping family members of incarcerated people gain resources and representation. I also talked to Ryan Snow at the Virginia Voting Rights Project, and he says those old ways of counting inmates as residents of the district where they were imprisoned, that makes no sense.
By doing that, you're artificially inflating the political power of those rural communities where the facilities are held by counting, thousands of people who, can't vote, first of all, while they're incarcerated, but also have no connection to the community, maybe never even set foot there before they were brought there and held there.
Now, there is a twist to this, Thomas. It's not just that Virginia ended this longstanding practice and things are going to be better. The Supreme Court of Virginia is right now currently considering a challenge to the new law, which could upend the plan to end prison gerrymandering, just as the Redistricting Commission is considering new maps. It was filed by constituents in the Senate district of Travis Hackworth, a rural district that stands to benefit from prison gerrymandering. Now, Thomas, with all the drama around the Redistricting Commission, this lawsuit could end up being yet another wild card.
Yeah, once again, redistricting continues to be a mess, Michael. Look, they should not count. If they are not having a say in the process of that locality, they shouldn't count for that locality. And as Ryan Snow hinted at, rural localities have actually, for the entire history of Virginia and much of the United States, have had a disproportionate voice in the General Assembly or the House of Representatives or wherever you look. And you can think back when it was the aristocracy, like blue bloods, plantation owners, who were the ones allowed to vote. And then they started adding restrictions and caveats, things like the prison gerrymander, as we gave more of a vote to people in urban areas. And the other thing I would say about this, Michael, is people who are in prison have just as much of a right to voice their opinion on civic conversations and engagement as people who are not imprisoned. And the fact that we remove their civil rights is not acceptable in 2021. So, what I would say, if the Supreme Court sides with the people trying to challenge it, then what the legislature should consider is to repeal the prohibition on felons not being able to vote.
That complicates this, because if incarcerated people could vote, then they would be constituents in Senator Hackworth's district, right? Like they wouldn't be constituents in their home district. They would be constituents in their prison district.
Right.
So, I mean, like if you did allow inmates to vote, you would have to return to prison gerrymandering, right?
Well, yes and no, because it wouldn't be gerrymandering anymore because they would all have a say in that electoral process. And that is the natural counter if the Supreme Court were to rule unfavorably. That is what a majority of both chambers and presumably a Democratic governor should do, is to re-enfranchise felons, should the Supreme Court rule that way. And that way, Michael, the term is called rat fucking.
Wait, what was that? Say it again.
The term is called rat fucking. When the conservatives trying to maintain prison gerrymandering, if they are to get their way at this, then we rat fuck their victory so that it turns to ashes in their mouth by restoring the right to vote for felons.
On that graphic note, let's turn to the next part of our podcast, which is your voicemails. Yes, that's right. We want your voicemails, and it's really easy to submit one. All you need to do is get on your smartphone and record some audio of you reacting to something that you heard on our podcast. It's just that easy. Now, today's voicemail comes from my friend, Paul Friedman, here in Alexandria, who is executive director of the gun violence prevention nonprofit known as Safer Country. You can find them at safercountry.org. He wanted to comment on a show we did last year with Lori Haas of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and Secretary Brian Moran.
We want to thank you for your program on the 2020 new gun laws in Virginia, one of which is an emergency substantial risk order law, or a red flag law. We've now initiated a project with Fairfax County, and we are working on creating a public awareness campaign around the law. We hope you will follow it as we go forward.
Paul Friedman has really worked tirelessly on this issue for years, and this new public awareness campaign he's created with the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors is a great example of that. Paul Friedman tells me this is the first of its kind. This is like the first ever public awareness campaign to let anybody in the country know that there is a new law about this. So, I mean, the key here is, the way this red flag law works, if there's somebody who seems to be a problem, or, demonstrating that he or she is a substantial risk, then the local authorities can temporarily ban those people from possessing a gun or buying a gun. So if you think about people in your family or people in your circle of friends, or maybe somebody who lives on your block, maybe they're having a hard time. Maybe they're sort of falling down a rabbit hole and maybe they're a danger. Citizens can take action here to alert the authorities, but they wouldn't alert the authorities unless they knew there was a red flag law to do it, right? So good for Paul Friedman for creating this thing. I hope it's a success in Fairfax County and other localities build on this.
Yeah, and specifically with the red flag law, we know there's a strong correlation between gun violence and preventing gun violence and domestic abusers specifically. So when you introduce guns into those scenarios or remove guns from those scenarios, you can drastically improve outcomes for everybody involved, right? Because if you are in the middle of a mental health crisis, yes, you're not going to appreciate somebody filing that red flag against you, but you are going to appreciate not having an incident with that firearm that you regret for the rest of your life. So this is the number one thing that governments and society, frankly, can do to keep us safe from the public health crisis that is gun violence. And it levels the playing field, right? So people who have guns like to imagine them as the great equalizer in some kind of scenario where they're up against somebody else with a gun and there's a shootout. And so they think that more bullets flying would be a good thing. Well, for the rest of us who are caught in the crossfire, none of that is good, right? So we should be minimizing the number of guns on the street if we want to improve public health and public health outcomes, including school shootings, including domestic violence, and all of these other and accidents, by the way, suicides. That's the biggest reason to have a red flag law in the first place. Because if you are depressed and you are potentially going to make yourself a victim of gun violence, you can't undo that, right? So anybody who knows anybody who has killed themselves and they did so with a firearm knows just how painful it is for the survivors and how much pain the person who did that was in at the time. And that pain is temporary, Michael. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. If you or somebody you know are experiencing suicidal thoughts, give them a call, talk it through with them. Like, kudos to Paul Friedman. I'm really glad that he is working on this PR campaign.
And, it also raises the issue of other gun violence prevention measures that, were not enacted. So in 2020, when the Democrats took over, they did a whole bunch of gun violence prevention measures. We talked about them on our podcast with Laurie House and Brian Moran. One that did not make it was the assault weapons ban, which we saw Senate Majority Leader Dick Saslaw actually introduce it and then walk away from it and abandon it. And the Democrats did not circle back around to that in 2021. And so, Thomas, what do you think the future of that is? I mean, like, it's kind of a campaign issue, although the Republican candidate for governor will not tell you what his position is on the assault weapons ban. I've tried. He has no position, or at least if he does, it's a secret one, and he won't tell you what it is. We know that Terry McAuliffe is for the assault weapons ban. But, I think it might end up being something the candidates for like House are asked in this upcoming election cycle. Are we expecting the next General Assembly to have an assault weapons ban?
Well, Michael, you mentioned Saslaw, which means the problem is in the Senate. So it's not the House. The House will get votes. It is a good issue for at least House Democrats to run on because it is something that everybody in the suburbs care about. And this is an issue that 88% of Americans want, including members of the NRA, by the way. So
members of the NRA, but not the NRA leadership.
Correct. But members of the NRA that aren't gun manufacturers recognize that their organization is better served by having responsible gun policies that make sure that people think of their product as in a good light. So, yeah, I don't know that it's going to happen, though, right away, even if Terry McAuliffe supports it, even if the House comes back in Democratic leadership, because you need the Senate.
One thing that also I thought was interesting about the assault weapons ban debate that happened in 2020 is, so you had Dick Saslaw on the Senate side, which indicated that the leadership was behind this, at least on the Senate side, or else you would not have had Saslaw actually introduce the bill. So, before he walked away from it, before he was against it, he was for it. And he was the leader of the Senate. On the House side, as you pointed out, had a lot more support. However, do you recall who the member was who introduced the assault weapons ban in the House?
Was that Mark Levine?
It was Mark Levine, which always struck me as strange. So here is the most controversial thing you could possibly do with guns. Well, maybe not the most. One of the most controversial things you could possibly do with guns. And you give it to the guy who's most willing to throw bombs and burn the house down. or at least he ended up with it. I don't know if they gave it to him or not. Actually, let me throw that question to you, Thomas. Like, what happened inside the caucus? How did Mark Levine end up introducing the assault weapons ban and not someone who would have been more measured with his language, like a Paul Krizak? Like, how did Mark Levine end up with that bill?
So that was an issue very close to Mark Levine's heart. His sister was murdered and a victim of gun violence herself. And the caucus believed it was a just thing to do to let Mark Levine carry that bill. As far as any like side deals or anything behind the scenes, I don't know that that's got anything to do with Mark Levine. I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying I don't know. The reality is, in that year, Democrats put up 8 big bills when they normally get one every couple of years, one big bill every few years. And they had 7 out of 8 victories as far as those bills passing goes. So if you kind of zoom out and look at it in the perspective of just having a sheer number to pass of substantial gun bills and gun violence prevention bills, then that's how you know that they've made a huge improvement just in the couple of years since that's passed. But yeah, Mark Levine did it. Somebody else will do it next time.
You know, it's interesting that what you were just saying about, like, they introduced, what was it, 8 and they passed 7. I believe that was kind of word for word the argument that Brian Moran made on our podcast. So looking forward, though, looking ahead, after the election, there's a new House of Delegates, there's a new governor. Are we going to see the assault weapons ban be a major discussion for 2022? Or are people just going to not talk about it the way they did in 2021?
Well, that's an open question, Michael. I'd say from the point of view of a legislature, they've done all the easy stuff. They've done the low-hanging fruit for the most part. And, they have to deal with big issues, and they've got a backlog of big issues to deal with. And I'm sure there's a sizable number of them that say, okay, we did that. We got to move on to the next thing because we're running out of time to be able to enact the change we want. There's going to be substantial pressure from the people who think like that to plow ahead and move forward with things that are not gun violence prevention bills. I would also say that some of it won't be up to them. Some of it's going to be up to circumstance. If God forbid another tragedy happens that pushes the legislature to act, then it's also an issue that they're going to win campaigns on, especially in the suburbs, because suburban moms don't want their kids exposed to gun violence in their schools. So it's a winning issue for Democrats.
The assault weapons ban particularly is a winning issue for Democrats.
The assault weapons ban particularly, but most gun violence prevention measures that reasonable people would consider common sense. It is a winning issue in the suburbs, which is where you need to win in order to retain control. And if Democrats get elected on that platform, they're going to be expected to do something. That said, I don't know that that's the first conversation they want to have.
That's why I was sort of curious about what we might see in 2022, because I can totally envision a scenario where nobody talks about it, nobody introduces a bill, it's not part of the discussion. I can totally see that scenario. In fact, I think that's probably more likely, frankly. Or I can also see a scenario where people got elected on this and they feel like they've got a mandate and they try to move forward with it.
Yeah, but here's the problem is still the Senate, because the Senate's not up for election this year. And if the bill can't pass in the Senate, if Joe Morrissey hasn't changed his position, if they don't have a majority of senators willing to vote for it, then there's going to be substantial pressure applied to the members of the House who want it not to put that bill in, because either the House is going to have to make it go away or it's going to die a painful death in the Senate. And some advocates certainly would say, pass the damn thing through the House, let the Senate deal with it in the way that they want to deal with it, and that's on their shoulders. But if you're looking from the point of view of a party that controls all 3 branches of government, and if you can't get something through that you're campaigning on, you get egg in the face of every voter who wanted it. All right, well, let's take a break, because when we come back, we'll be joined by the one, the only David Toscano, former Democratic leader of the House of Delegates. He's the author of a new book out this week titled Fighting Political Gridlock: How States Shape Our Nation and Our Lives. Oh, hey, look, Transition Virginia has another voicemail, and this one's from Richard Krause. Let's see what he's got to say.
This podcast is so jackleg that John Frederick's radio show is 5 steps above it.
Oh, never mind. It's just another crank call.
We want your voicemails, and it's easy to do. Just launch the Voice Memo app in your smartphone, record a reaction to something you've heard on the podcast. It's that easy. Send the sound file from your smartphone to transitionvapodcast@gmail.com. We might even play your voicemail on the air.
This is Trevor Sutherland, and you're listening to Transition Virginia with Michael Pope and Thomas Bowman. Reminder, this is a podcast, not a radio show, because they couldn't get actual sponsors.
We're back on Transition Virginia, and we're joined by the former Democratic leader of the House of Delegates. He's the author of the new book, Fighting Political Gridlock, How States Shape Our Nation and Our Lives, which is being released this week by the University of Virginia Press. Mr. Leader, David Toscano, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you guys. Thanks so much for having me on.
So what compelled you to write this book in the first place?
Well, when you're in the throes of the legislature, you don't really have time very much to think about writing. But once I decided to retire, I got to thinking about it because I'd been keeping notebooks every year I'd been in the General Assembly, and that was 14 years. Originally, I thought I would write a book about my 25 years in public service, and I wrote a lot and turned in a 1,100-page manuscript, and the publisher said, "You cannot publish something this large." So I decided to focus a lot about the states and how they affect us state by state across the country. And that has become this book. There is another book that is on its way, probably published in early 2022, that will be about Virginia and its political transformation during the time I was in the legislature. So I've been doing a lot of writing.
Clearly you have. Now, the title of your book, Mr. Leader, is Fighting Political Gridlock, but I think it could have had an alternative title, which is States Matter, and Here's Why. Your book is meticulously researched. You got 64 pages of endnotes. I know I'm going to actually keep this thing on my desk as a reference guide because of those endnotes. And you break down how Washington is failing to take action in so many areas and how states are filling the void in terms of education and healthcare and environmental concerns. Who is the intended audience for this book?
People are interested in any kind of politics and the future of the country. If you look at what's happening in Washington, where national policy is bogged down and the Congress is in gridlock, and it's really hard to do anything. I mean, you look at the infrastructure bill, which we thought was going to be passed a while ago, and even that now is hung up, something which has some degree of bipartisan support. And then you say, let's look at what's happening in states. And the states, on the other hand, they're passing a budget every year that is largely balanced. They're funding critical needs like education. 90% of the funding comes from either state or local governments and only 10% from the feds. And significantly, they're making very critical choices in the area of voting rights, which really have an impact on how Congress operates. So while things are gridlock in Washington, we're focused on Washington, unfortunately. We have to refocus on the states because that's where change can happen.
Leader Toscano, you've got a chapter about civil discourse in this book, and you talked about Delegate Ibrahim Samira interrupting President Trump during the anniversary celebration of the Commonwealth of Virginia. What did you make of that? Do you think Samira accomplished what he wanted to do, or was it counterproductive?
That's a really hard one to answer. I mean, there is a proper role for civil disobedience and disruption in trying to encourage the country to think about change. Now, whether this really was the appropriate avenue to do that, I think is an open question in my mind. I don't think he changed any minds by doing that. He did draw a lot of attention to himself, and now he's no longer in public office. He was defeated in a primary. I don't know what happened there with voters in that district. I'm not close enough to say. But, there's a role for civil disobedience, but it really has to be, I think, civil, because at some point, if there's so much disruption, the country has a hard time getting back within the political guardrails. I think Trump has really led the way in uncivil discussion and has really led us down the road of running into the ditch and not staying within the guardrails. We make better progress if we stay within the guardrails, especially elected officials. They have a higher standard to maintain, and the public takes a lot of cues from elected officials and how they should conform themselves.
Now, one of the strongest features about your book, Mr. Leader, is the individual stories that you bring to make a broader point. There's Tom Garrett reading Toni Morrison on the Senate floor to illustrate the debate over education. And then there's a story of a young guy by the name of John Grisham who becomes disenchanted with politics after serving in the Mississippi House. And then, of course, there's your own experience with the great blackout of 1965. How important was it for you to make sure these academic discussions had a human face?
Well, it's very important. I'm sort of trained as an academic, but you got to tell a story, and because it helps people understand really what's going on. And there are countless stories like this. I mean, there's a story about a woman that didn't get into the book who was living in Flint, Michigan. And of course, Flint, Michigan was deindustrialized in the 70s and 80s, very poor community. And the state took an action in Flint that led to the appointment of what they called an emergency manager who could run the city. And that emergency manager changed where the water came from in Flint. And as a result, lots of people got sick, several people died, and they're now with a multi-million-dollar bill to replace all the pipes in Flint. So there are countless examples like that where states take an action that have real impacts on people's lives. And I tried to reveal that in some of the vignettes I tell in the book. That Tom Garrett is a great example because states, by and large, control the curriculum within which youngsters learn. And Texas had this big debate about whether they were going to keep Hillary Clinton and Helen Keller out of their history books. And we had, all over the country, there's this debate about critical race theory and whether it's even taught at all or whether it should be taught in the school. So these are things happening in the states.
Mr. Leader, actually, I'm going to follow up on what you just said, which is critical race theory, this debate over so-called critical race theory, which we actually covered on a previous episode. This is like a law school concept. I mean, it's almost like as if we're saying equitable distribution in divorce cases is being taught in the third grade. It's not. It's a law school concept. The words critical race theory do not appear anywhere in your book. I'm wondering about the timing of that. Was that chapter on education largely written before that particular debate exploded?
Absolutely. That chapter was written before. And, this does show how fast things change in the area of state politics and national politics. The Republicans seized on what people were trying to do in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder to kind of use it as a political wedge issue. The irony, of course, is that critical race theory is an academic theory that's really taught in law schools that many people don't understand at all. And if you were to ask people why they oppose critical race theory, they really couldn't even explain what it is. It's not really taught in schools. What is being taught in schools, and which I think is really quite productive, is the history of race relations in the United States, which has its good and its bad points to it. And I think it's a very important element of our curriculum. And it's being hijacked by people in the conservative elements of the country who want to use it to create wedges between people so they can win elections.
You've got a chapter in your book that's very close to my heart, your chapter on labor issues. You say that former Governor Scott Walker lost re-election in 2018 largely because of his anti-labor initiatives and his support for the so-called right to work law. Do you think Republicans can be successful and be pro-labor at the same time?
Well, Republicans have had a history of being successful and pro-labor at the same time, except it was like 50 years ago. I mean, they did in certain states. I mean, New York is a good example where Nelson Rockefeller, I don't know if anybody remembers him, but he was governor of New York for several terms, had a very good relationship with the unions. Not everybody, can't always agree on every issue, But I think Republicans should pay attention to labor issues if they're going to try to recapture what they need to recapture in some of these states in order to win.
Virginia has tried to chart a course of being pro-business and pro-labor at the same time. And we asked a previous guest what they thought about how the legislature and the government had done that, if they were successful or if there was more work to be done. How do you see that evolving? Do you see Virginia currently as pro-labor now, or do you see that as something that we still have a lot of work to do on?
Well, what is wonderful about America and wonderful about state politics is it's always a push and a pull, and you're going to have business interests arguing for their point of view, and you'll also have labor organizations arguing for their point of view. In Virginia, for so long, it was really business having their way. And now I think with the election of Democrats, you get many more changes coming into play, the passage of the Minimum Wage Act, a lot of changes in workers' compensation, labor agreements in Northern Virginia that have been negotiated as part of transportation packages. So you have a lot of good things happening, but there are always going to be pushback against those things. And hopefully, legislators will be able to find the right spot that gives labor some control and without compromising business, because you got to have business activity to generate the tax dollars that are necessary to fund education, environmental protection, and other things that are key.
In your chapter on civic engagement, you talk about a personal experience that you had as minority leader back in 2013, when you could have objected to the Republicans introducing a new budget and really thrown a wrench into the calendar and the process. And you said you had members urging you to do that, to make an objection and throw a wrench into the process, but you decided against doing that. Walk us inside that decision.
Well, and then the question is, did I make the right decision? At the time it seemed right, but boy, did I get people angry at me, particularly people in the Democratic Senate who wanted to throw a monkey wrench into the process. My feeling at the time was you have traditions in the body that you should try to honor because it builds collegiality and it builds the ability to get things done. Virginia's always prided itself on turning out a budget on time, although we haven't done it all the time, and trying to figure out a way to work together to get things done as much as you can. And I was concerned that this would violate a tradition where unanimous consent is granted to a member to introduce any bill that he or she wants. Now, that being said, I've had some other thoughts about that, because there have been times where a bill has been defeated and then a Republican has tried to reintroduce it. And that bill was so controversial, but they never really mentioned what the bill was. And so to grant unanimous consent without knowing what the bill is, I think is dangerous. And that undermines the collegiality of the body as well. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. Judgments are made all the time, but people remember the decisions that get made, and they often use those decisions against people later on or to argue for a certain point of view. The example of the Speaker of the House striking down a redistricting plan, even though it would have given the Republicans a huge advantage, is a great example. And I think part of that is discussed in the book.
You talk about how, from your perspective, ranking states, the process of ranking states is kind of silly in some ways, but it is also important when you want to compare how states sort of work against each other. And most of your book is actually aimed right at that, sort of comparing Virginia to other states or comparing states against themselves. From your estimation, where does Virginia stack up against other states?
I think it ranks very highly against other states. You look at the AAA bond rating, and I think Virginia has the longest continuous AAA bond rating by two independent rating agencies in the country. And people say, well, who cares about that? Well, you care about that when you have to borrow money to build a new building, and it costs you less to borrow money because you have a AAA bond rating, and that helps the taxpayer. So that's an important element. You look at the ratings by Oxfam on worker rights, which is kind of interesting because at the time I wrote the book, Oxfam had branded Virginia as the worst state in the country for labor rights. Now, I didn't really agree with that, and I thought it was kind of silly because I think One of the reasons why they did that was because Virginia still has right to work. But now Virginia has changed its ranking. I think it's now in the 20s. And people pay attention to that because if you use the same criteria, at least you can measure what's happening over time. And you look at it in terms of voter rights too. Virginia has improved dramatically over the last 4 years in terms of voter rights, and that's showing up on the national ranking. So I think the rankings do make a difference, but at the same time, you got to look beneath what's being said and who's saying it, because oftentimes people have access to grind and they want to trot out the ratings as a way to grind those axes.
Let's turn real quick to the Dillon Rule. A lot of people have the impression that the Dillon Rule is very strict and prohibits anything that a locality might want to do unless it's explicitly authorized. But you say in your book, it's not quite as rigid as some people argue, and you specifically mention the transient occupancy tax. So is all the hate of the Dillon Rule misplaced?
Well, the argument about the Dillon Rule is to some degree misplaced because the states still can preempt local decisions, even if they are a home rule state where localities generally make the decision. So, for those people who don't understand this distinction, and it takes off from the title of the chapter. The title of the chapter is called Tip O'Neill is Still Dead. Remember, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. Well, all politics is not local. The states control a lot of local politics by their decisions. And the Dillon Rule is part of that. The Dillon Rule basically says that localities can't do anything unless the state specifically authorizes them to do that. Oftentimes, legislators in those states come forward with what they call enabling legislation that allows a locality to do something. The transient occupancy tax is a classic example, where countless jurisdictions come to the General Assembly and say, we want this tax. And the General Assembly generally gives them the ability to do that. But if a locality, even in a home rule state, says they want to do something and state doesn't like it, they can what they call preempt the legislation just by passing a law. And the states rank supreme in that regard. They can control those localities. So be careful. Even if we got rid of the Dillon Rule, you still have a problem in states essentially controlling localities and overruling when they don't like something that's going on.
In your book, you also have a fascinating discussion about the motion picture tax credit in Virginia, which cost taxpayers about $55 million in like a 5-year period. Like many issues in this book, though, you don't really give us your opinion. David Toscano, if you had your way, would this tax credit exist in Virginia or not?
In my view, it should go away in Virginia. I don't think it gives us the bang for the buck that we need. And if you look at the studies around the country of other places that have this credit, it's basically been a giveaway to the motion picture industry. It does create some jobs in the short term. It does create some revenue in the short term, but basically people come in and then they leave, and the taxpayer is stuck paying the bill in a way they don't have any control over it because it's something written into the tax code. It's not written into the budget where the legislature can review it every year. What I would prefer is, look, let's create a motion picture tax fund, and that in the budget, so it can go up and go down depending on how the legislators think about it. And people can apply for the fund if they need a grant to do this, that, or the other thing to bring a picture to Virginia, and do it that way. There are countless tax subsidies in all state budgets that are written in the tax code and not in the budgets themselves. So they're sort of baked in and they have a force of their own, and there's no accountability. People get these tax subsidies and the taxpayers are paying the tune, and it's not clear that the tax subsidies always work the way they're supposed to. Coal tax credit, I can go on for 10 minutes about that. Virginia had a coal tax credit for ages, and we began fighting that fight back in the early 2010s. The tax credit never made any sense because it didn't create any jobs, and the coal companies were losing money year after year after year. So we're just paying this money to the coal companies, and that made no sense. The coal tax credit is now done in Virginia. It no longer exists. That fight has been fought and won for the taxpayer.
You talk about how ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has had success as a factory for Republican bills, but Democrats have never been able to replicate that. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, we like to pride ourselves in writing our own bills. I don't know why that is the case. There are other bill manufacturers, shall we say, out there, and actually most state legislators who are looking for an idea or how to prepare an idea will look to other states. And there are groups like Future Now, and there are other groups out there that are more progressive in their orientation. They haven't been as effective as ALEC, but they still are out there. And I think you just have to be careful with all these bills, and especially in Virginia, because you just take a bill from another state and slap it on Virginia, and it doesn't always work because you got to maybe have to change several parts of the code. We've had cases where, say, Republicans basically taken a bill from the bill manufacturing ALEC and just slapped the Virginia name on it. And in some cases didn't slap the Virginia name on it and produced a bill with another state's name, or just left blank. That's very embarrassing to the legislator, but it does occur.
Leader Toscano, your book, your perspective, they're simply fascinating. And where can people find your book?
Well, they can go on my website and click down where the book is, and I think it'll be directed to the University of Virginia Press. It's on Amazon. People can get it there. I've got some in the trunk of my car.
Thanks again, Leader Toscano. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
So that's all for this episode.
Support us on Patreon or send us an email to transitionvapodcast@gmail.com.
Like and follow at TransitionVA on Twitter and anywhere pods are cast.
Read the transcripts at transitionvirginia.com, and special thanks to Emily Cottrell for figuring out what the heck we're saying.
Thanks for being on the transition team. We're your hosts, Thomas Bowman.
And I'm Michael Pope.